Hey folks, it is Thursday, July 3rd. I appreciate you watching here today. I want to start briefly with the tropics. I'm going to transition that very quickly into the precipitation forecast. We talked yesterday about how the forecast, maybe for the middle part of the country over the next 7 to 10 days, is looking relatively favorable, but there have been some trends maybe, I'm going to call it like day 11 to 12 out through the 17th, maybe the middle to late part of July. That I'm not going to use the word concerning yet, but things to watch for. So we're going to dive into that, maybe the middle part of this video. I'll finish up briefly on Europe. They're in the midst of a heat wave now, so I want to talk about that. But I mentioned to start, do want to talk about the tropics here. This satellite loop I'm showing you, this is an infrared satellite loop kind of overnight into the early morning hours as of the recording of this video over Mexico. And I'm doing that because it's the same one from yesterday where we were looking at Flossie, major hurricane category 3. You might be asking yourself, well, where did Flossie go? She has weakened considerably here today. So looking in this area here, over the last 24 hours, losing all semblance of tropical thunderstorm development, revealing that low-level center. It's always so cool when they kind of reveal those low clouds still spinning around. It was just very recently a category 3 storm, right? So pretty strong as it goes for hurricanes. And so it still has that inertia, that spin, and it's going to retain that. It can even retain that for days despite not having a mechanism to strengthen whatsoever. So you can see those low clouds spinning there. Always cool to see that. So eyes off the tropics for now in the Eastern Pacific. I'm actually going to touch on this later in the video because we might see some development further to the south and east of Flossie getting out into next week, which very well could impact some of our forecast here, at least in the southern plains. So we'll talk about that later. The reason for that rapid strengthening of Flossie is pretty obvious if you look at this map. So just to the south of Mexico, you have bathwater-like temperatures similar to the Gulf of Mexico, very favorable for hurricanes. But as Flossie moves toward the northwest, just losing that warm tropical sea surface, and the storms, the strength of this system weakens very considerably as a result of that. And ultimately, there's this like blue wall south of Cabo. When storms hit that, they tend to just evaporate, just like Flossie has. Jump over and look closer to home here, just at the mosaic of the national radar across the United States. You can see it's relatively quiet versus what we were looking at earlier this year. This is kind of similar to yesterday when I showed you the same map. We do have some tropical moisture pluming into the southern plains, the southwest. We've seen Las Vegas have a busy week. We saw some wind reports across Arizona. Rainfall still moving kind of through the Lake Mead area. Parts of Texas, we have flood watches out for West Texas, Permian, kind of the Pecos River area, some flood warnings in there as well. But across the northern, 2/3 of the country is still kind of quiet. You can follow some of these storm motions. I should probably call these shower motions. They're probably not even thundering at this point. You can kind of follow those motions around like that, and that's following that upper level ridge that's been taking hold of our weather this week in the continental U.S. We're still seeing that here, even just in that radar image. If we jump over and look at the water vapor satellite imagery, we can see that tropical moisture plume down here in the southern plains. See the dry air underneath the ridge that we just talked about. And if we follow those clouds, that water vapor around that ridge, it's pretty easy to see where the axis of that ridge is setting up somewhere here over Minnesota, maybe Iowa and Nebraska. As a result, the Storm Prediction Center, the reports just yesterday, this is July 2nd, blow that up a little bit. Very few reports underneath the ridge as we'd expect, and then just a few scattering reports, again, around the entire periphery of the continental U.S. ridge. Always cool to see that pattern. Same thing holds true if we look at the last 24 hours of precipitation. Again, just kind of following that clockwise flow all the way around. I mentioned that MCV yesterday. We were watching that kind of sneak through Nebraska and through southern Iowa. We kind of have our skepticism as to how much that would help form new storms. You can see not a ton of activity as it's made its way east and even get into western Illinois. But some areas, some of these acres did get a little bit of precipitation, but you're talking maybe 1/10 of an inch at the most, up to about 1/4 or 1/2 of an inch in areas in eastern Nebraska here. This is an area that's been wet, but there are some pockets in here, a few counties that are still dry, lingering from that, what we'll call that I-80 springtime drought. So it is nice to see, we'll take even 1/4 of an inch of rain, I think, at this point in some of those acres there. And then finally, if we just look at the 500 millibar winds this morning, again, you can see the anchor or the axis of that ridge somewhere here over the central plains as it moves from the west toward the east this week. Tomorrow, it's going to inch its way further east, maybe over Illinois. And then finally this weekend, getting more over into New England and the mid-Atlantic, bringing some heat back to that area. I did mention we'll cover the tropics a bit here this morning. We are still keeping an eye on this area of spin. This is related to an upper level low, which has been parked over Florida here this week. National Hurricane Center keeping an eye on it. Still at about 50% chance of development. It was a little bit lower yesterday. I'm skeptical it's going to be relevant for our weather outside of some showers just kind of lingering in the coastal plains of the Carolinas here. If we jump over and look at infrared satellite imagery over that area, you don't really see anything of note. A few kind of lingering showers and storms here off the coast. But I don't see any, coherent low-level spin in the lower part of these clouds. It seems like just a lot of southwest to northeast motion here. So we'll keep an eye on it. If it spins up something, it's likely to head about that way. But on the backside of it, again, could see some showers in some parts of the Atlantic coastline. I want to jump over and look at the Storm Prediction Center today. Of course, we have that clockwise spin in the atmosphere, right? We followed those storm motions around like that. So the periphery of that is where we'll likely see storm development today. Could see some even getting in here into the northern Corn Belt here, maybe portions of central northern Iowa, and then southeastern Minnesota over into Wisconsin, perhaps even Michigan. I'm skeptical of the rain coverage within this marginal risk area. So while we could see a few severe storm reports, I don't think we're going to see wide swaths of an inch plus of precipitation in here, and I'll show you why in a second. Also watching eastern Montana today, some of these areas still dry, again, from springtime drought. Still in drought classifications here in portions of central and eastern Montana. So getting storms in here, avoiding some of the severe weather, but getting some of the precipitation out of it wouldn't be the worst case scenario here. And then Las Vegas, busy week with a dust storm. Earlier this week has had some rainfall, still in a marginal risk area here today, with that monsoonal moisture lingering around. I do want to zoom in on that. Let's call it the kind of northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, eastern Iowa risk today. So this is taking you that forecast through this morning from the HRRR model. There were those lingering showers. We questioned whether they were even thundering here in the western Dakotas. Those are moving through this morning and through eastern Dakota. Very little coverage there in terms of rainfall. You can see that little disturbance here moving through Minnesota now 7 p.m. We're after sunset at this point, and the HRRR really struggling to develop anything even on this calendar day. As we transition to midnight, we see development go up in western Wisconsin near Eau Claire. Might see some of this push toward the south and east here overnight. This is 3 a.m. Central, 4 a.m. Central, now 5, 6, 7 a.m. Getting maybe a decent swath of 1 inches of rain here through portions of southern and south central Wisconsin. Some decent growing acres in here, but moving toward the metro area of Chicago overnight. And then finally, lunchtime tomorrow, we're expecting additional thunderstorm development over in the central and western plains, but not a wide area of heavy precip here across that marginal risk area. It's conditional, and what I mean by that is we're not even sure storms are going to form today. They might form even overnight in some select areas. I'm going to pull up the 3-kilometer NAM just to get a different opinion here. You can see it tries this morning actually to produce some weak showers here over central and eastern Iowa. Again, skeptical of that, but it is there in that model run. And then overnight, I shouldn't say overnight, it's about 6, 7 p.m. northern Iowa. Again, tries to form a few storms here before weakening quickly. And just as like a hint, whenever I see a model, we call these CAMs, the convection allowing models, whenever they form a storm and then immediately weaken it, a frame or two later, do you see how that storm formed and then an hour or two later was gone? I get skeptical that the storm's even going to form, because whatever kind of formed it, there was clearly very little maintenance to keep it going. So I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but I'm definitely keeping my skeptical hat on. And then overnight, maybe seeing some development in western Wisconsin, right? We just looked at that before finally moving storms through the eastern part of the country, Green Bay, or I should say the state. But this is overnight, even early Friday morning, now 9, 10 a.m. Friday morning. And then finally, as we go through the evening on the afternoon and evening on Friday, those storms going up over in the western and central plains. So you can see not a wide coverage area here for additional thunderstorm development. The reason I spent so much time on it here this morning is there's some acres in here that are dry. Northern Illinois, portions of southern Michigan, over into northern Indiana. So seeing any storm systems in here that would maybe coalesce and continue toward the southeast would be of relevance. The problem is, and the reason you saw that kind of lack of development, is the ridge that's accessed here is moving this way all the while overnight tonight. And that means you have rising heights in the upper levels of the atmosphere over this area today. And that is not favorable for storms. We talked about cold waters, not favorable for hurricanes. You can think of those rising heights all the while as being unfavorable for storm development. So while there is kind of this little packet of disturbance coming through, the atmosphere in a broader kind of general personality trait does not want to form storms here later this afternoon. You're seeing those fight that. As a result of that ridge, if we just look at the all hazards map here this morning, seeing these heat advisories here over the upper Midwest and parts of Minnesota, the Dakotas, looking at warm temperatures here today. I shouldn't call them warm. We can use the hot word here in the middle of July. There's flood watches here in West Texas and then some red flag warnings over the Intermountain West. But otherwise, pretty quiet map, all things considered here for the early part of the month. If we jump over and look at high temperatures here today, this is from the National Weather Service. Contoured in their seasonal departure from average, so you can see those hot temperatures that we talked about getting up toward triple digits in western South Dakota near the Black Hills, otherwise mid to high 90s. Running over into the kind of high 80s toward the low 90s across the Midwest here today. Underneath that tropical moisture plume, the clouds, some of the showers here. We talked about Las Vegas, West Texas, over in eastern New Mexico, seeing relatively cooler temperatures. But generally a summertime day across a wide area of the country in terms of those temperatures. I mentioned that ridge is going to be moving east as we go through the forecast period. So tomorrow, seeing those warmest temperatures move off into the mid-south, the Midwest, and the upper Midwest. And then Saturday, moving even further east over the central and eastern Corn Belt. Sunday, over the New England. And then finally by Monday and Tuesday, seeing some cooler temperatures. I say the word cool with asterisks because we're talking, mid to high 80s rather than low to mid 90s across portions of the central and then the Midwest. But seeing temperatures rise back here over the western U.S. where we've seen drought classifications persist here through the spring and summer and through portions of the Pacific Northwest and the Intermountain West. So unfortunately, seeing temperatures return toward the triple digits in central Washington, parts of eastern Washington, over toward Boise. Continuing next week as we see the transition toward that northwest ridging again, bringing thunderstorm complexes and relatively cooler temperatures. We talked about this yesterday, the chance that next week the forecast gets pretty favorable for entering those reproductive growth stages across a wide area of the Midwest here. Now, there's variable planting dates in here, especially the Mid-South where we've seen so much rain. Drive through areas here and you'll see corn, 10 inches tall versus, getting near head height. So some variable planting dates and then maturities in here, but nonetheless, this forecast relatively favorable for production crops. We can see this if we just look at the 500 millibar height forecast. This is from the ECMWF. I'm going to take this quickly through the forecast here because we've kind of talked about the near term. There's that upper level ridge. I've already played it out toward Friday morning. So the holiday, you can see the warmest temperatures here for the Midwest. Trying to prevent storm development. This is now taking into Saturday afternoon. And then Sunday, we talked about the warmest temperatures moving off into New England and then ridging trying to build back into the Pacific Northwest. This is now Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday. And you can see more proper four corners ridge. This is a much more typical summertime pattern. And then that northwest ridge atop it. And so this is going to squash some of that tropical moisture that we've seen, some of that monsoon development as we get out into next week with that ridge parked right over that area. We just talked about how that tends to disfavor storm development. Warm temperatures, a lack of precipitation warming or coming to the Canadian prairie, parts of Montana. So hoping to get some precipitation in here in the short term with this heat and this dry weather returning next week. But portions of the Midwest, if I take this forecast back through Sunday, I'm going to reverse it just a second here. You see all these little short waves kind of sneaking in here. This is Sunday. These are all chances for precipitation. You can even see one here. I can count at least 3. And then this upper level low near Louisiana. Those kind of sneak through. Those are all precipitation makers Sunday through Monday. As that ridge develops over the Pacific Northwest next week, But keeping those lower heights and storm chances through the Midwest as we go through Wednesday and Thursday next week. Relatively seasonal temperatures on the way for the central and eastern part of the country. And then even taking this forecast out through the 11th, still favoring that northwest ridge here. You can see some of that ridging tried to sneak off east over Canada. Perhaps bringing some brief warm temperatures through the week as we go through it in the central and eastern part of the country, but still largely staying in the same regime, which again, seasonal temperatures for the Midwest, the Mid-South with precipitation chances even out through next weekend. I did want to mention, southeast of Flossie. I talked about this at the beginning of the video that we could see some renewed development behind it. If we jump over and look at satellite of that area, this looks pretty favorable. So compare that to Flossie, which has lost all its tropical development. We're well down here into the southeastern portions of the North Pacific. And this looks pretty favorable for development, just these deep, rich tropical thunderstorms. You can even kind of see in the low levels here, some spin starting to show up, some clockwise spin. So I can see why, pretty obvious that this has a 80% chance of formation. I would maybe even put that closer to 90 just looking at that infrared satellite this morning. But I show that because as I take this forecast out into next week, we mentioned that Four Corners Ridge. Do you see that setup here? This is Tuesday to Wednesday. there's that potential next system trying to develop. And we've seen these this year as these move toward the west. If they stay far enough south where they can retain tropical development, remember, if they get toward the north, they evaporate quite literally. But they kind of yank the ridge along with them. We can kind of see that here. See how just over the last few frames, it starts to pull that. And that keeps lower heights in this area here. So even while this, let's call it the Alberta ridge, tries to move east, we retain some lower heights here in the middle part of the country. With that, you can see how it's kind of pulling that ridge. It allows these lower heights to stay in here. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. I don't dismiss these hurricanes that far away. They can have an impact on our weather here, even in the middle part of the country, certainly in these southern plains in the southwest, where they affect those moisture plumes. I'm going to jump over and show the ECMWF precip forecast here. I'm going to take this through slowly. So this is through Thursday. I'm going to take it through Thursday evening, 7 p.m. And you can see just some pretty weak precipitation signal here in eastern Iowa, southeastern Minnesota as a result of the storms, and then nothing overnight. So there's the ECMWF opinion on these overnight storms, maybe in Wisconsin. Very little development at all. So we go into Friday afternoon and evening. Again, western and central plains. Could perhaps see some severe weather here, maybe the Dakotas, through South Dakota into Nebraska, even Kansas here. We'll have to watch northeast Colorado, Wyoming, but just marginal risk out from the Storm Prediction Center for portions of the central and northern plains. I'm not even going to show it because we don't see a slight risk yet. I'm not too worried about it right now. The bigger story is probably the precipitation. On Saturday, this moves toward the east. Again, marginal risk out here for portions of the upper Midwest, Minnesota, western Wisconsin, and through Iowa, Kansas, eastern Nebraska. Some acres in here still requiring some precipitation as we get toward those reproductive growth stages. Take this into Sunday afternoon. See the precipitation just following along that front here through Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, and through Michigan, down through Oklahoma into Texas. That continues. You can see that stalled front now on Monday morning through portions of the eastern Corn Belt with perhaps some light precipitation. This is not going to be widespread. You can see it getting weakening through that forecast period here as it enters the eastern part of the country. But renewed development back through the central northern plains, the Canadian Prairie. This is on the early part of the week, Monday evening. So I mentioned all those little short waves coming through ahead of that developing ridge over in the northwest are chances for precipitation. We're seeing that in the 7-day forecast. And that's coming through now. Iowa, Illinois. This is on Tuesday. These northwest flow thunderstorms coming through this area could be severe as well. We'll have to keep an eye on the details there as they unfold. Even on to next week now, Thursday, Friday. Just widespread potential thunderstorm development across a large chunk of the eastern two-thirds of the country here. I will back the forecast up. I'm going to focus more on the prairie here. So watching chances for precipitation here Saturday and Sunday. Continuing into Saturday afternoon here, southern Alberta, parts of Montana. Take this into Sunday evening. You can see much of Alberta here, portions of Saskatchewan. Moving through maybe more of the prairie here on Tuesday, but I'm watching that cutoff to see when that ridge starts to dominate the forecast because you can see very few precipitation chances through the next week after the early part of the week in that area. If we look at the WPC, their 7-day forecast here. Again, wide part of the country looking at above an inch of rain. As this system moves toward the southeast here next week, this only takes us out to Wednesday, so we're missing some of the northwest flow thunderstorms I showed you at the end of that forecast run. Remember, through this weekend, as that front moved through, it weakened all the while, so that's why you're seeing these precipitation values come down toward the eastern Corn Belt. I'm watching that specifically because, again, there's pockets in here that are dry relative to this time of year, and can see decent rain coverage here across the prairie into eastern Montana, but not widespread, an inch plus of rain. So still concerned about this area as we go into a warm and dry stretch at the end of next week. If we compare that to the ECMWF, it's even drier here in parts of the prairie, Saskatchewan, Saskatoon over towards southern Alberta. Drier in the central Corn Belt as well. I mean, this is only looking at maybe half an inch of rain across I-80 into northern Indiana, maybe even less in southern Michigan, over into portions of the eastern Corn Belt here. Some of these acres have had too much rain this year if you get farther into the southern areas, so they're not necessarily inviting more of it, but still keeping an eye on a drier corridor and through here, at least through the next 7 days. We can see that in the 5-day and then the 7-day precipitation anomalies from the ECMWF, so drier in this area here as that ridge takes hold. Chances for rain across Montana in the near term. Good chances for rain across the central, we'll call this the central plains, the southern plains, and the upper Midwest as you transition into the central and eastern Corn Belt, into the central kind of mid-south and then the southeast, looking at a drier stretch out through next Wednesday to Thursday. And then I am going to take that forecast into a 4 to 10. I'm not going to jump into the long range yet, but I do want to show that those northwest flow thunderstorms are on the way near the end of next week. So this takes us out. This is a 4 to 10 day forecast. So it does take us out through next weekend. And you can see some of this precipitation coverage expanding. And the exact kind of axis of this, where this is going to set up, is not clear. So while this one kind of points right through the middle Mississippi Valley, the Tennessee River Valley, this could shift toward the north over the central and eastern Corn Belt, could shift over the south. So these 4 to 10 day forecasts, you can't put these in Sharpie. They kind of wobble around a little bit, especially in July. Temperature-wise this week, staying cooler in the southern and central plains. You can see that. We're looking at 5 to 10 day temperature differences from each of the models. So here's the ECMWF ensemble, GFS ensemble, and then the AFS. Pretty good agreement there with that ridging here over the central and eastern part of the country, those warmer temperatures. But the 5 to 10 day, this is the next work week now. We're keeping the relatively cool temperatures across the central part of the country. A little bit warmer as you get near the kind of portions of the Great Lakes. You can see that here from the AFS. It's been a little bit more aggressive. But you're not looking at, widespread mid to high 90s here across the Midwest. Generally looking at upper 80s, maybe low 90s, with relatively cooler overnight temperatures, trying to sneak back into the 60s, where we are seeing that proper heat set up, triple digits more over the Northwest, the Canadian Prairie, Oregon, Idaho, Western Montana, etc. And then there's some differences here as we get out to day 10 to 15. I mentioned that at the beginning of this video. You can see the AFS and the ECMWF tries to bring more of that ridging, we talked about that, over Canada and the upper Midwest. There's the AFS going very warm over Ontario, parts of Quebec, the Mid-Atlantic, New England as well. Whereas the GFS is a little bit more, tepid, isn't quite as aggressive with that warmth, keeping the cooler temperatures maybe parked over the Midwest further out into the forecast period. I mentioned that hurricane playing a role here, maybe keeping some of these cooler heights in this area here, despite this stronger ridge moving over the northeast. Now, none of these forecasts between the three bring the worst of the heat stress right into the middle part of the country. And I think that's still good news, but I am keeping an eye on some of that heat pushing off toward the eastern part of the country as we go into late next weekend really. And I'm going to show you that on the ECMWF AFS ensemble here. So I'm going to take this forecast quickly. There's the ridge we talked about this week moving over the east. If I show you, this is now next week. We see that northwest ridge over Montana, bringing the heat, the lack of precip to the Canadian Prairie. There's that Four Corners ridge we talked about, keeping the lower heights here across the Great Lakes and through the southern plains. You can really see that even accelerate near the end of next week, those precip chances that we talked about here through the Mid-South and the Midwest. But you'll notice as I take the forecast out, we see some troughing try to set up here over the Gulf of Alaska. In fact, a lot of the lower heights that were up here, the northern Atlantic, have pushed more so over the Arctic. So you can kind of see that. If I play this forecast back quickly, you can see those lower heights trying to push into even to the Gulf of Alaska, over the Chukchi Sea here. And as they do that, they're allowing this ridging to build in here over what we'll call the Great Lakes, Ontario, and Quebec. And that's why you saw the AFS go over much warmer in this area here in that day 10 to 15. We're looking at all the way out toward July 14th and 15th now. We are still keeping these lower heights in here because that Four Corners ridge hasn't bled back into the middle part of the country. It's even gotten stretched out here off the coast of California, perhaps due to some tropical development down here. That's kept the forecast relatively cool in this area. But I'm keeping an eye on it because it's a little close for comfort into some of these acres here, even some of the drier ones that we've been watching. This would be a pretty favorable forecast for going back over, I would think, wetter in parts of the Northwest, at least losing some of the extreme heat, given the troughing and the position here, bringing some flow back over this area. But still keeping an eye on that ridging there. The ECMWF ENS, if I take that quickly out, you see those lower heights pull back toward, again, the Gulf of Alaska. This is the 13th to 14th of July. Bring that ridging over parts of Ontario and Quebec. There's that Four Corners ridge, relatively lower heights here. But even the ENS still keeps this ridge a little bit stronger, and that Four Corners ridge, in fact, not getting tugged as far west. So keeping some of that heat risk a little bit close for comfort out. Again, 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. Those higher heights lingering in this area here. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on that kind of fork in the road as we get through next weekend. If I show you the ECMWF ENS temperatures, you can really see, here's this week, there's the ridge. I'm taking this one day at a time, these temperature departures from average. It's moving over the Midwest, the Eastern Corn Belt, Mid-Atlantic. Going to next week, there's the Northwest ridge, really exemplified in the heat over the Canadian Prairie, the Western U.S., the Four Corners, keeping those cooler temperatures here all the while in the southern plains in the central part of the country into the Midwest. Again, still relatively, even on the warmer side for the upper Midwest, just not that extreme heat that we worry about in the middle part of July when we're tasseling. So take this in through next weekend, and then now we're out to the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. You'll notice it starts increasing the heat in this area here, right? Keeping that kind of too close for comfort, starting to push back into some, major production areas. So keeping an eye on this in that kind of week 2 to 3. This is all the way out now, July 17th through the 18th. Can't put too much weight into this now, but seeing it in some of the model runs here, it's worth mentioning. And if we look at the precipitation departures from average and we take it out to that same time period, with the ridging trying to sneak back into this area, some of those precipitation values coming down, maybe increasing across the Mid-South and the Carolinas. But that's that area I'm still a little concerned about, kind of mid to late July. Meanwhile, we talked about next week, the end of next week, this area filling in better with precipitation coverage. Despite maybe this corridor missing some of it over the next 7 days, it looks like the 7 days after that, this precipitation coverage improves. We can also see this a bit in the Bermuda High. So this is the ECMWF ensemble looking at those sea level pressure anomalies. If we started here today, Bermuda High is taking a break over and toward Ireland. We talked about the heat in Europe. That's allowing some of this ridging to move across the central and eastern part of the country. The good news is, if I take this forecast into next week, well, the Bermuda High comes back to Bermuda, and lo and behold, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week, this corridor here goes back wetter. But as I take this forecast back toward next weekend, this isn't the 13th, 14th, we see some weakness out here. The Bermuda High sneaking back toward the Azores, some higher pressure even showing up near Ireland again. We worry about the Killarney High in July. Here's Killarney. It's right near the west coast of Ireland. And July 15th, so that starts showing up again. And that's kind of right in that time period where I started getting a little bit concerned about warmth and dryness pushing back into portions of the central part of the country, maybe the Midwest. So again, seeing a few signals here in that kind of week 2 to 3 time frame. I'll have to keep an eye on. The AFS ticking out to the 12th, 13th, 14th of July. Still kind of that similar kind of weakness in the Bermuda High showing up. The 8 to 14 day temperature outlook from the CPC does start to get into that middle of July timeframe, and you can see them sneaking the temperature values back up here across the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Eastern Corn Belt, staying cooler through the southern and central plains. Through this area here, it's been kind of a rough decade in some parts of these areas here, so perhaps a favorable forecast in some ways. Temperature to precip conversation now July 10th through the 16th. This is out through next weekend and even into that kind of that week 3 time period. You can see this area filling in. We've talked about that. But again, keeping an eye on this area here as we transition to the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th of July for some heat and dry concern. As for next week, the greatest risk for temperatures is going to stay out west with that Four Corners Ridge expanding into the northwest ridge. So you can see the moderate risk for high temperatures on the lower Colorado River Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. And then finally, wanted to finish the North American conversation with those sea surface temperatures. We see kind of every year this part of the ocean, in the Northeast Pacific, in our highest yielding years tends to stay warm between June 20th and July 5th. And not necessarily every year, but much more than not. And this area has stayed warm here into early July. This at least takes us to July 1st. So we'd have to see this area kind of rapidly cool in the next 3 to 5 days. I'm not seeing that. And so the general consensus is still, despite some heat risk lingering maybe in late July, we're keeping things moving enough through here. We're keeping lower heights in through here, thunderstorm chances, northwest flow. We've only set up a few kind of concerning areas for dry conditions that generally better chances than not that we're looking at a higher production year just based on this map and what we know about where there's drought existing today. I mentioned I want to finish with Europe here. They're in the midst of a heat wave here this week, but the good news is there's some precipitation and cooler temperatures on the way. So if I take this forecast Thursday, Friday, see just kind of weak precipitation out through the end of this week. I don't think they celebrate the holiday tomorrow, but you'll have to check. And then now getting into Sunday afternoon, and then Sunday evening can see widespread precipitation across Western Europe, parts of the British Isles here, and through Central Europe, now Germany, over into Poland on Monday afternoon. And this is going to bring temperature, a cold front, and then widespread precipitation relief to the country, even getting now through Ukraine as we go through the next week. And if we look at temperature anomalies, we can even see those temperatures starting to come down in the 0 to 5 day range because that's moving through this weekend. That heat shifting off more to Eastern Europe and then toward Russia as we go through the period this weekend into next week, but more temperature relief coming for the Europe in the long range. So not seeing as widespread heat over the next kind of 10 days, which is good news for them. Hope you have a safe and happy 4th of July with your family. Thanks for watching.